Chapter 5. The Man Who Had Nowhere to Go. In the early morning, it was the second morning after my recovery, and I believe the fourth after I was picked up, I woke through an avenue of tumultuous dreams, dreams of guns and howling mobs, and became sensible of a hoarse shouting above me. I rubbed my eyes and lay listening to the noise, doubtful for a little while of my whereabouts. Then came a sudden pattering of bare feet, the sound of heavy objects being thrown about, a violent creaking, and the rattling of chains. I heard the swish of the water as the ship was suddenly brought round, and a foamy yellow-green wave flew across the little round window and left it streaming. I jumped into my clothes and went on deck. As I came up the ladder, I saw against the flushed sky, for the sun was just rising, the broad back and red hair of the captain, and over his shoulder the puma spinning from a tackle rigged onto the mizzen spanker boom. The poor brute seemed horribly scared, and crouched in the bottom of its little cage. "Overboard with 'em," bawled the captain. "Overboard with 'em. We'll have a clean ship soon of the whole bilin' of 'em." We stood in my way, so that I had perforce to tap his shoulder to come on deck. He came round with a start, and staggered back a few paces to stare at me. It needed no expert eye to tell that the man was still drunk. "Hello," said he stupidly, and then with the light coming into his eyes, "Why, it's Mr. "Prendick," said I. "Prendick be damned," said he. "Shut up. That's your name, Mr. Shut up." It was no good answering the brute, but I certainly did not expect his next move. He held out his hand to the gangway by which Montgomery stood talking to a massive, gray-haired man in dirty blue flannels who had apparently just come aboard. "That way, Mr. Blasted Shut Up, that way," roared the captain. Montgomery and his companion turned as he spoke. "What do you mean?" I said. "That way, Mr. Blasted Shut Up, that's what I mean. Overboard, Mr. Shut Up and Sharp. We're cleaning the ship out, cleaning the whole blessed ship out, and overboard you go." I stared at him dumbfounded. Then it occurred to me that it was exactly the thing I wanted. The lost prospect of a journey as sole passenger with this quarrelsome sot was not one to mourn over. I turned towards Montgomery. "Can't have you," said Montgomery's companion concisely. "You can't have me?" said I aghast. He had the squarest, most resolute face I ever set eyes upon. "Look here," I began, turning to the captain. "Overboard," said the captain. "This ship ain't for beasts and cannibals and worse than beasts any more. Overboard you go, Mr. Shut Up. If they can't have you, you goes overboard. But anyhow you go, with your friends. I've done with this blessed island forevermore. Amen. I've had enough of it." "But Montgomery," I appealed. He distorted his lower lip and nodded his head hopelessly at the gray-haired man beside him to indicate his powerlessness to help me. "I'll see to you presently," said the captain. Then began a curious, three-cornered altercation. Alternately I appealed to one and another of the three men, first to the gray-haired man to let me land, and then to the drunken captain to keep me aboard. I even bawled entreaties to the sailors. Montgomery said never a word, only shook his head. "You're going overboard, I tell you," was the captain's refrain. "Law be damned, I'm king here." At last, I must confess, my voice suddenly broke in the middle of a vigorous threat. I felt a gust of hysterical petulance, and went aft and stared dismally at nothing. Meanwhile, the sailors progressed rapidly with the task of unshipping the packages and caged animals. A large launch with two standing lugs lay under the lee of the schooner, and into this the strange assortment of goods were swung. I did not then see the hands from the island that were receiving the packages, for the whole of the launch was hidden from me by the side of the schooner. Neither Montgomery nor his companion took the slightest notice of me, but busied themselves in assisting and directing the 4 or 5 sailors who were unloading the goods. The captain went forward, interfering rather than assisting. I was alternately despairful and desperate. Once or twice, as I stood waiting there for things to accomplish themselves, I could not resist an impulse to laugh at my miserable quandary. I felt all the wretcheder for the lack of a breakfast. Hunger and a lack of blood corpuscles take all the manhood from a man. I perceived pretty clearly that I had not the stamina either to resist what the captain chose to do to expel me, or to force myself upon Montgomery and his companion. So I waited passively upon fate, and the work of transferring Montgomery's possessions to the launch went on, as if I did not exist. Presently that work was finished, and then came a struggle. I was hauled, resisting weakly enough, to the gangway. Even then I noticed the oddness of the brown faces of the men who were with Montgomery in the launch. But the launch was now fully laden, and was shoved off hastily. A broadening gap of green water appeared under me, and I pushed back with all my strength to avoid falling headlong. The hands in the launch shouted derisively, and I heard Montgomery curse at them. And then the captain, the mate, and one of the seamen helping him ran me aft towards the stern. The dinghy of the Lady Vane had been towing behind. It was half full of water, had no oars, and was quite unvictualled. I refused to go aboard her, and flung myself full length on the deck. In the end, they swung me into her by a rope, for they had no stern ladder, and cut me adrift. I drifted slowly from the schooner. In a kind of stupor I watched all hands take to the rigging, and slowly but surely she came round to the wind. The sails fluttered, and then bellied out as the wind came into them. I stared at her weather-beaten side, heeling steeply towards me, and then she passed out of my range of view. I did not turn my head to follow her. At first I could scarcely believe what had happened. I crouched in the bottom of the dinghy, stunned, and stared blankly at the vacant, oily sea. Then I realized that I was in that little hell of mine again, now half swamped, and looking back over the gunwale I saw the schooner standing away from me, with the red-haired captain mocking at me over the taffrail, and turning towards the island saw the launch growing smaller as she approached the beach. Abruptly the cruelty of this desertion became clear to me. I had no means of reaching the land unless I should chance to drift there. I was still weak. You must remember, from my exposure in the boat, I was empty and very faint, or I should have had more heart. But as it was, I suddenly began to sob and weep, as I had never done since I was a little child. The tears ran down my face. In a passion of despair, I struck with my fists at the water in the bottom of the boat and kicked savagely at the gunwale. I prayed aloud for God to let me die. Chapter 6. The evil-looking boatmen. But the islanders, seeing that I was really adrift, took pity on me. I drifted very slowly to the eastward, approaching the island slantingly, and presently I saw with hysterical relief the launch come round and return towards me. She was heavily laden, and I could make out as she drew near Montgomery's white-haired, broad-shouldered companion sitting cramped up with the dogs, and several packing cases in the stern sheets. This individual stared fixedly at me without moving or speaking. The black-faced cripple was glaring at me as fixedly in the bows near the Puma. There were 3 other men besides, strange, brutish-looking fellows, at whom the staghounds were snarling savagely. Montgomery, who was steering, brought the boat by me, and rising, caught and fastened my painter to the tiller to tow me, for there was no room aboard. I had recovered from my hysterical phase by this time, and answered his hail, as he approached, bravely enough. I told him the dinghy was nearly swamped, and he reached me a piggin. I was jerked back as the rope tightened between the boats. For some time I was busy bailing. It was not until I had got the water under, for the water in the dinghy had been shipped, the boat was perfectly sound, that I had leisure to look at the people in the launch again. The white-haired man I found was still regarding me steadfastly, but with an expression, as I now fancied, of some perplexity. When my eyes met his, he looked down at the staghound that sat between his knees. He was a powerfully built man, as I have said, with a fine forehead and rather heavy features, but his eyes had that odd drooping of the skin above the lids which often comes with advancing years, and the fall of his heavy mouth at the corners gave him an expression of pugnacious resolution. He talked to Montgomery in a tone too low for me to hear. From him my eyes traveled to his 3 men, and a strange crew they were. I saw only their faces, yet there was something in their faces, I knew not what, that gave me a queer spasm of disgust. I looked steadily at them, and the impression did not pass, though I failed to see what had occasioned it. They seemed to me then to be brown men, but their limbs were oddly swathed in some thin, dirty white stuff, down even to the fingers and feet. I have never seen men so wrapped up before, and women so only in the East. They wore turbans, too, and thereunder peered out their elfin faces at me, faces with protruding lower jaws and bright eyes. They had lank black hair, almost like horsehair, and seemed as they sat to exceed in stature any race of men I have seen. The white-haired man, who I knew was a good 6 feet in height, sat a head below any one of the 3. I found afterwards that really none were taller than myself, but their bodies were abnormally long, and the thigh part of the leg short and curiously twisted. At any rate, they were an amazingly ugly gang, and over the heads of them, under the forward lug, peered the black face of the man whose eyes were luminous in the dark. As I stared at them, they met my gaze, and then first one and then another turned away from my direct stare and looked at me in an odd, furtive manner. It occurred to me that I was perhaps annoying them, and I turned my attention to the island we were approaching. It was low and covered with thick vegetation, chiefly of the inevitable palm trees. From one point a thin white thread of vapor rose slantingly to an immense height and then frayed out like a down feather. We were now within the embrace of a broad bay, flanked on either hand by a low promontory. The beach was of a dull gray sand and sloped steeply up to a ridge, perhaps 60 or 70 feet above the sea level, and irregularly set with trees and undergrowth. Halfway up was a square enclosure of some grayish stone, which I found subsequently was built partly of coral and partly of pumiceous lava. 2 thatched roofs peeped from within this enclosure. A man stood awaiting us at the water's edge. I fancied, while we were still far off, that I saw some other and very grotesque-looking creatures scuttle into the bushes upon the slope. But I saw nothing of these as we drew nearer. This man was of a moderate size and with a black negroid face. He had a large, almost lipless mouth, extraordinarily lank arms, long, thin feet, and bow legs, and stood with his heavy face thrust forward, staring at us. He was dressed like Montgomery and his white-haired companion, in jacket and trousers of blue serge. As we came still nearer, this individual began to run to and fro on the beach, making the most grotesque movements. At a word of command from Montgomery, the 4 men in the launch sprang up, and with singularly awkward gestures struck the lugs. Montgomery steered us round and into a narrow little dock excavated in the beach. Then the man on the beach hastened towards us. This dock, as I call it, was really a mere ditch, just long enough at this phase of the tide to take the longboat. I heard the bows ground in the sand, staved the dinghy off the rudder of the big boat with my biggin, and freeing the painter, landed. The 3 muffled men, with the clumsiest movements, scrambled out upon the sand and forthwith set to landing the cargo, assisted by the man on the beach. I was struck especially by the curious movements of the legs of the 3 swathed and bandaged boatmen. Not stiff they were, but distorted in some odd way, almost as if they were jointed in the wrong place. The dogs were still snarling and strained at their chains after these men, as the white-haired man landed with them. The 3 big fellows spoke to one another in odd guttural tones, and the man who had waited for us on the beach began chattering to them excitedly, a foreign language, as I fancied, as they laid hands on some bales piled near the stern. Somewhere I had heard such a voice before, and I could not think where. The white-haired man stood, holding in a tumult of 6 dogs, and bawling orders over their din. Montgomery, having unshipped the rudder, landed likewise, and all set to work at unloading. I was too faint, what with my long fast and the sun beating down on my bare head, to offer any assistance. Presently the white-haired man seemed to recollect my presence, and came up to me. "You look," said he, as though you had scarcely breakfasted. His little eyes were a brilliant black under his heavy brows. I must apologize for that. Now you are our guest. We must make you comfortable, though you are uninvited, you know. He looked keenly into my face. Montgomery says you are an educated man, Mr. Prendick. Says you know something of science. May I ask what that signifies? I told him I had spent some years at the Royal College of Science and had done some researches in biology under Huxley. He raised his eyebrows slightly at that. That alters the case a little, Mr. Prendick, he said, with a trifle more respect in his manner. As it happens, we are biologists here. This is a biological station of a sort. His eye rested on the men in white who were busily hauling the puma, on rollers, towards the walled yard. I and Montgomery, at least, he added. Then, when you will be able to get away, I can't say. We're off the track to anywhere. We see a ship once in a 12-month or so. He left me abruptly and went up the beach past his group, and I think entered the enclosure. The other two men were with Montgomery, erecting a pile of smaller packages on a low-wheeled truck. The llama was still on the launch with the rabbit hutches. The staghorns were still lashed to the thwarts. The pile of things completed, all three men laid hold of the truck and began shoving the ton weight or so upon it after the puma. Presently Montgomery left them, and coming back to me, held out his hand. I'm glad, said he, for my own part. That captain was a silly ass. He'd have made things lively for you. It was you, said I, that saved me again. That depends. You'll find this island an infernally rum place, I promise you. I'd watch my goings carefully if I were you. He hesitated and seemed to alter his mind about what was on his lips. I wish you'd help me with these rabbits, he said. His procedure with the rabbits was singular. I waded in with him and helped him lug one of the hutches ashore. No sooner was that done than he opened the door of it and, tilting the thing on one end, turned its living contents out on the ground. They fell in a struggling heap, one on the top of the other. He clapped his hands, and forthwith they went off with that hopping run of theirs, 15 or 20 of them, I should think, up the beach. Increase and multiply, my friends, said Montgomery. Replenish the island. Hitherto we've had a certain lack of meat here. As I watched them disappearing, the white-haired man returned with a brandy flask and some biscuits. Something to go on with, Prendick, said he in a far more familiar tone than before. I made no ado, but set to work on the biscuits at once, while the white-haired man helped Montgomery to release about a score more of the rabbits. 3 big hutches, however, went up to the house with the puma. The brandy I did not touch, for I had been an abstainer from my birth.